Welcome, everybody. I'd love to introduce Arndt and the team from the Global Trade Analysis Project, who've been talking about kind of modeling and tracking trade across the entire world and the connections to climate change and decarbonization. Welcome.
Thank you. So, thank you for this invitation to speak with the Google Modeling Group. Greg, I'm going to go for maybe 30, 35 minutes. Is that all right? 35? Is that good? Okay, great.
Yep.
So we're going to focus on trade and environment in an interconnected world. The plan here is to give first an overview of the Global Trade Analysis Project so you can see what's there. I'm the new director, so I've been in place for now about 4.5 months. So I was involved with GTAP back when I was getting my PhD and assistant professor, but I'm back now quite a few years later. And we're going to look at 3 applications in 3 categories, and I'll cover those a little bit later. So what is the Global Trade Analysis Project? Well, GTAP supports a global network of about, depending on how you define it, if you've sort of ever touched GTAP, it's around 30,000 people. In terms of people who are really actively working, it would be around 1,000 analysts. And the goal is really to improve the quality of quantitative economic analysis of global issues in support of deliberate decision-making. So it's a decision-making tool. And we've had a philosophy since the early 1990s when the project started of collaboration in data and community building. So we should collaborate where we can, and then an open marketplace for ideas. Once we have the collaboration part done, we can discuss analytically what's to be done. GTAP has become quite influential. It's a common language for conducting economic analysis of global policy issues. And these results are now influential in trade, climate change, energy, environment decision-making all over the world. We benefit from a consortium of key institutions from the major regions of the world. These are the kind of different institutions. There's 31. They provide a sort of a baseline level of financial support and advisory, notably on the data. In the United States, we have 4 government agencies: U.S. International Trade Commission, Trade Department of the U.S. Commerce Department, U.S. EPA, USDA, 4 international organizations: International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, International Development, Inter-American Development Bank, IFPRI, International Food Policy Research Institute. We have some privates, McKinsey, and a specialized infinite sum modeling. In Europe, it's DG Trade as part of the Commission, Joint Research Center. We have the OECD, the World Trade Organization, the International Trade Center, and a number of UN agencies, as well as some specific departments in the UK, France, and a pair of universities, Thun and Wageningen. In Asia, the Trade Cabinet Office of Japan, Peking University, the Asian Development Bank. And ARIA is the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. So it's a very, very nice consortium group. So what do we do? The key thing that GTAP does is lower barriers to high quality analysis. We do that really in 3 ways. Data, I'll get into that. As I said, models, we supply standard models, cutting edge models, but our philosophy is you don't need to collaborate with us on the model. You can have your own model. However you want to represent the world is the way you can go ahead. And then training, how you use the data and the models. It turns out that we're now a large group in a fairly specialized community of sort of economy-wide modelers. So we're one of the largest concentration, if not the largest concentration of top-flight economy-wide modelers in the world. And we serve as a platform for discussion and debate at a conference. The next one's in Kigali, via technical and policy seminars, and via our Journal of Global Economic Analysis, which is now in the top 2.5% of citations for economics journals. Okay, so what is the main thing? Big thing people think about with GTAP is the database. It's value flows of economic activity at the global level. So 65 sectors for more than 160 countries/regions. We have a time series from 2004 to 2019, not every year. A number of extensions, which I'll just get into. We've just released version 12. It's a pre-release to consortium members. There are always errors in these data, and the consortium members help us find those over, and we'll release it to the public at the end of the year. The new features include the items listed, been a lot of emphasis on land use and land cover along with emissions, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So GTAP, we don't produce any data. We're an assembler of data. So we take from all sorts of sources, and these are all listed here, and what our role is to produce the core data set. And our role is to make the world coherent. Right now, if you take the raw data from Comtrade, the world exports more than it imports. So we're sending something to the moon, or there's something wrong with the statistics. And so we make the world consistent and coherent. That's the role, that value that we add. Along with assembling kind of a core economic data set, we have a number of satellite extensions, energy and emissions, electricity, profit flows, migration and remittances, breaking the world into agroecological zones and land cover types. We break up the trade into more detail. It's called MRIO, where it goes. Does it go to firms, households, investment, government? We have various satellites that look at standardized projections, so people can work off of those. What are negotiated agreements to 2050? What are tariff reductions associated with those? Various other sort of common tools that people can benefit from. Extensions we've been working on recently include circular economy, that was just introduced. Critical minerals has been a big priority for us and continues to be so. It's very difficult. We hope to have a preliminary data set by the summer. Air pollution, we also recently completed work on food balance sheets, including food loss and waste at a global level. So it's quite a range of stuff. Just to give you an idea of some ongoing work before we go into the applications, the OECD is producing a flagship environmental outlook report on the triple crisis, climate change, pollution, and biodiversity loss that's coming out this fall. They view a core contribution of the report as their integrated modeling framework, which is their in-house global CGE model, which is underpinned by GTAP data, aligned with the image modeling framework, which is an environmental model maintained by the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, and those are merged together. GTAP has a role in writing the final chapter, which is conclusions and policy recommendations. We're working with them right now. Second, Trump tariffs. A lot to do here. Most consortium members are doing substantial work on the Trump tariffs. They're not published. It's internal analysis, just trying to figure out what's going on and what they need to do in their own particular shops and with their own perspectives. We do have a published analysis, mostly focused on Mexico, Canada, with the Brookings Institution, which came out in February. We also do a lot of work in mitigation and trade. We have a forthcoming report by the World Bank. Interesting, the World Bank was looking at how, what are the opportunities for developing countries, in a world that's mitigating, and what kind of trade opportunities are there. But one of the interesting things is, fossil fuels are widely traded, and basically as you shift to renewables and electrify transport and so forth, you tend to shift from tradable to non-tradable, and you tend to drive down trade worldwide. So this is some examples. So I wanted to do 3 applications in 3 categories to kind of show with really an environmental focus. So the first is regional approaches to confronting climate change, and we're going to look at the cooperation in the Tigris-Euphrates River Basin, use a multi-region general equilibrium model, which is kind of the standard. Then we're going to go on to using structural models to understand the past. We'll look at the green revolution and the environment. This uses a gridded partial equilibrium approach. And finally, we have a broad category, global to local to global. And for that, we're going to look at production implications for Brazil of a US-China trade war, very topical. And that's a linked multi-region general equilibrium model with a gridded partial equilibrium model. So I'll try to run through each of those fairly quickly. So cooperation in the Tigris-Euphrates River Basin. This is a just produced paper in 2020 4, which has a longer title, but is focused in that way. This is the Tigris-Euphrates River Basin. The black is the basin boundary. Important fact is that the source of the two rivers is the mountains of Turkey, and a lot of the water comes from Turkey. So Turkey is a very important player in downstream flow for the rest of the region. This is not, the story of this region is not a particularly happy one over the past few decades, and not surprisingly, the level of collaboration on the river basin is quite low. So what we're trying to do is look at really changes in water scarcity by 2050 under alternative climate futures, and then we'll look at some water policy issues. I'm going to focus on collaborative versus non-collaborative. We'll look at the economic outcomes of these changes in water scarcity, and then, as I said, assess these collaborative and non-collaborative actions among the countries in the basin. So the way we do this is, we start with the general circulation model. Now we're going to work with the CMIP6 ensemble. We're going to work 2 in the ensemble average and 1 model, which was particularly strong climate change effects. We'll link that to a hydrological model to look at water scarcity given temperature and precipitation, and then link that up to a global computable general equilibrium model that's designed for these purposes to get to the economic implications. And the interesting point is, 11, 12 years ago, this would have been, very much on the research edge kind of application. Now it's just a good example of an application that can be done in a relatively straightforward way. So that this is a good example of what we're able to do relatively quickly and pass on. Just to focus on what the GTAP model is, this is a schema. The really important point is this would be sort of a representation of one region or one country in the model, if it's a country. And basically, the world is a closed system. And so, what is imported should have been exported somewhere else. If the government is spending, it has to get its revenues from somewhere. Savings has to equal investment. The private household has to respect its budget constraint. Producers can't use more labor than exists inside the economy. So all of these things are really useful constraints to impose, especially when you're dealing with big shocks or long time frames. So that's the main thing for the model that allows us to, work within a closed system. So we run for this 8 scenarios. We have 2 climate scenarios. This is called representative concentration pathway 4.5 and 8.5. 4.5 is probably more mitigation than we're going to get in the real world. And 8.5 is more emissions than we're going to get in the real world. So we're probably going to land somewhere in between those two. So it's not a bad bracketing. We'll take also the 2 approaches to models within those representative concentration pathways, the ensemble average, and then a strong effects model, the selected model, and then 2 levels of effect of water scarcity on the efficiency of capital stock. That's kind of a somewhat uncertain parameter. So this is what we get in terms of water scarcity. And basically, climate change is generally bad for water scarcity. It makes it more severe. More climate change, representative concentration pathway 8.5, gives you more water scarcity. It is notable that the ensemble average in Syria gives you less water scarcity. It's quite possible you can get more rainfall. In fact, you do get more rainfall just in general. But as things get worse, and the selected model is substantially worse, as I noted. So these are kind of what happens to GDP under the climate of 2050. And there's 8 scenarios here. The least effect is the lowest climate change with relatively low water scarcity impact. The biggest effect is the selected model and a high impact of water scarcity on the capital. And the triangle is the average of all 8. So generally pushing negatively, less and more in various countries. So this whole country, not just the basin. So if we skip kind of to the end, because there's a lot to cover, basically there's quite a big benefit from full collaboration. You're not going to get there, but under RCP, the lower scenario, you get about 42 billion. Under the 8.5, you get about 50% more, about 60 billion. And for the Tigris-Euphrates, which is TE, so it's all aggregated together, you can pass from a negative climate change effect, and if it precipitates a great deal of collaboration, then you actually end up, if that's what happens, you're going to end up better off in terms of GDP than you were with no collaboration and no climate change. So a lot of benefits from climate change, from collaboration are possible. So just some remarks on this. I've done a lot on regional collaboration throughout my career. It's hard, but can yield real benefits. And the canonical example is the European Union. Brexit has given us a counterexample. Hasn't gone particularly well, leaving. And the results that we've seen here in the Tigris-Euphrates and other areas at least illustrates that climate change likely expands the benefit of regional collaboration. Tigris-Euphrates is one example. Other examples include, free food trade, for example, within Africa. So the African Continental Free Trade Area is an exercise, I think, worth the effort that's going on. One that's being considered in ASEAN region is electricity trade, which would involve a great deal of undersea electricity cabling. And that's, I don't know if that's good or bad, but it's certainly possibly worth the effort for a variety of reasons. Moving on.
Question.
Yeah.
Actually, diving into kind of how you model such things. So what does cooperation mean? Is it a particular sharing scheme among the regional partners? Is it like more hydrological water flow kind of a notion?
Yeah. So one example would be, Turkey, has the, it's they're upstream, so they could take water and use it at very low usage and very low productivity rates, for example. Right, and just be using water for purposes that could be better used downstream. This is pretty much full collaboration, so in line with aligning trade and various regulatory policies as is done. So it's a quite strong regional collaboration scenario here.
Okay, so if I think regional collaboration, I guess in economic terms, it really sounds like a common tariff-free kind of market where the water goes according to the elasticity function.
Exactly.
To pay for it.
And it would be basically a customs union type arrangement in there, which is sort of what. And then the European Union has a deeper integration where rules are similar, so you don't get non-tariff barriers to trade as well as collaboration in water.
So then, I guess you're not actually talking about the regulatory climate that would have this. I'm actually thinking like the Israeli water policy is a centralized authority, whereas the Colorado River and California is a bunch of fragmented rules for individual landowners, which is a market, but it's a highly structured market that is not at all a free market. And I'm trying to understand kind of how your analysis relates to regulatory policies.
Yeah, this one. That's correct. You would have to dive down into that, and a lot of these issues, and it's going to be the same in other areas. Relate to the way the institutions function, right? You're talking about the water markets in Colorado, on the Colorado River Basin. I'm talking to you from Fort Collins, where we're the headwater state, right? And so, the institutions are important, and it is incredibly balkanized here and elsewhere. And there's quite a lot of gain to be trying to allocate water a little more efficiently. So just for an example, in Fort Collins, it turns out that there's actually 4 water districts in the city of Fort Collins where I live. And some of them are dependent on Western Slope water rights, and some of them are not. So if the Western Slope was headed towards dead pool, right, not only a few years ago, and so it could have been the case that no water is coming from the West Slope to the East Slope. There's a tube through the mountains, and there's a street in Fort Collins where one side of the street they have water, and the other side they don't.
Right.
And nobody looked at their, when they bought the house, it would have told you what water district you're in, but you wouldn't even know that they're. I didn't know there were 4 until just a few months ago.
Right.
Yeah.
So
So
then how
that's
does, no, this makes sense. And actually, this is actually interesting. This is a structural issue in the sense that there are some water pipes that go to some specific houses, and that's just how the system was built, right?
That's right, exactly. So a lot of the as you would notice, it's institutional issues over and over again. The same in power in the Western United States, right? Or in the United States overall, right? Very balkanized power system that's institutionally designed to dig up coal, put it in a power plant, and serve your area, right? And it's not designed to throw power, on, across wide areas of space when you have, very, very variable wind and solar resources along with some batteries. So these institutional issues are key.
Okay, so then okay, this is interesting. Like normally when you think of Tigris-Euphrates, you're thinking of political conflict, but you're also highlighting just the physical infrastructure can be balkanized that will prevent efficient allocation of resources.
And the institutions can be balkanized, right? If all you've ever done is dig coal up and put it in your power plant, and that's the way you've run your power authority, it's a whole new world when you need to trade with, and it's giving up control of your generation resources, right? And that's happening all over the world as well.
So then, how would you, in translating the idealized economic model, which is free trade is good, to summarize, to policy implications, which I'm also thinking of things like global shipping, obviously balkanized, but just by the physics of the earth. But
right.
You can make recommendations about what kind of shipping capacity would reduce, separation, balkanization, and that kind of stuff. Or
right.
natural balkanization of agriculture. We have opposite summer and winter. It's a feature and a bug, right? So
That's right.
yeah, how do you translate that to recommendations in practice?
So, if you take the trade side, right, I think the transport's relatively efficient, right? It's not that bad. Some of the institutions in water tend to be, quite problematic, right? And very, very large differences in the marginal product of the utility of water. And then that's been ongoing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this is where when you say climate change is forcing you towards more regional solutions, you're driving those marginal products up and down, right? Some places, it's just not enough water, it's very high, or at some places you might be moving out of anyway. So there's a lot of reason to up your regional collaboration efforts. When you look at really bouncy solar and wind, right? In a way, there's small is beautiful and bigger is better, and they both hold in the wind and solar issue, right? So being able, this is why ASEAN would potentially want to link with pretty expensive undersea cables, because maybe it's windy in Malaysia, but it's not down in Jakarta, right? And Malaysia has a hell of a lot, and with a very, very steep power curve, right? So 5 miles per hour more wind is giving you 75% more power, right? Something like that. So you're getting big changes in the output, which is smooth if you're going across a wide area of space, which is the whole idea of the Western power pool that's going on in the United States as well.
Okay, so with this suggestion translation to practice, it sounds like the reality is lumpy, and there's a kind of a network style model. This is now the physical impediments to to free trade. So you have to kind of say that look for all the asynchronies, anti-correlations, and link them. And that would be kind of the generalized way of thinking about how to make things more balanced. Like actually, very much like capital markets. They look for arbitrage opportunities and
that's right. You're looking for an arbitrage opportunity in the policy space, right? And you can look at climate change as driving arbitrage opportunities in particular ways, and ones that will favor, right, for energy and food in particular, which tend to be traded not so long distances broadly. I know wheat goes a long way, but wheat is just one element of the diet. Most foods don't actually go all that far. And so So regional trade is really, really quite important if you're going to live in a more variable world. And the same if you're going to have a more variable power production, regional trade becomes quite important. You can't throw it from Finland to South Africa, but you can throw it potentially from the DRC to South Africa.
Right. And does that suggest that if we think of it as arbitrage, there is for the non-direct conflict kind of things, which then just pride, but you do have like regular economic commerce does have a ready way of dealing with these problems.
That's right. So there are already power pools, and some of them work better than others. But certainly, United States a really good example, right? Well, you remember the shutdown in Texas, right? Mm-hmm. When it got cold, and all of a sudden, and that's largely because they're not part of any power pool at all.
And that's arguably pride. They themselves like this.
And that's a relic of an age when you were using different set of technologies partly, right? And the same for the Western power pool.
Got it. Well, yeah, right? Thank you very much. This is extremely helpful.
Yeah. And for then when you go to the United States, a big country, right? China's a big country, but if you're ASEAN and you want to get these benefits of wind and solar, then you want to spread out across space. Well, those countries are pretty big, but they're not that big, and you can benefit a lot, right?
Yeah,
Malawi would have a hell of a time generating all its own power in wind and solar. They need a lot of batteries, whereas a link up, right? So it's a big difference. Let me get to this because I think this one's quite interesting. So this is just a technology, green revolution in the environment. A recent paper just came out this year, and basically the top line there is an index of agricultural output. It's almost quadrupled. And then if you look at the next one is input, not land, about doubled, a little more than doubled, and land has gone up by about 10%. So output going up much, much more than input. So typically we think we put in more input, we get more output. We put in more input, but we got much more output, and we ascribe that to technology, total factor productivity. The resources are working more efficiently. And where does this come from? And especially in the developing world, it comes from typically R&D. So a lot of ag GFP growth, total factor productivity growth, is explained by R&D. And then there's been so here, and you look on the left, it's mostly either publicly funded international research or own public R&D within those regions and countries. Private is important in the developed space, but not so much in the less developed areas, at least historically. So what's been going on? We're pretty sure that this TFP has contributed to output growth, and that it's really helped a lot with people. A poverty reduction you'd be hard pressed to get going from a world of almost 40% down to a world about 8% without this. And also probably contributed to growth and development processes. This largely involves bleeding people out of the countryside and into urban areas. And if you aren't able to produce the food, as I said, the food doesn't really typically go all that far. Then you slow down your development process overall. The implications of TFP for the environment are less well understood. What has this done? And there's a lot of people who now feel that this really subsidized a lot of environmental destruction, given that agriculture is a major source of destruction of the environment. So this study looks at historical crop improvements, the latest data on that, using a gridded model to assess impacts on crop land use, threatened biodiversity, and carbon stocks. And the reason you use a gridded approach is because it just sort of matters where the expansion occurs. So if you're going to move into Brazilian or Amazon forest, you're going to release a lot more carbon than if you go, somewhere in southern Argentina, for example, there. So that's one fact. The other reason to looking is actually most biodiversity or a lot of it is sitting in relatively few hotspots. So about 2.5% of the world's land surface supports more than half of the world's plant species. and not quite half of bird, mammal, and reptile species. So if you're expanding into these hotspots, then you're potentially creating greater environmental damage than you would get otherwise. So this is the other model that we use. It's gridded, 120,000 grid cells. This one's global. It's flexible. We can do it elsewhere. But it basically combines land inputs, non-land inputs to create production, goes into a market, and there's a demand with prices for food. And the demand's driven by prices, income, population. And then there's an exogenous biofuel or a biofuel demand that's there as well. So we need, if we're going to look gridded, we need gridded TFP growth, which recently came out, 2023. So this looks at the effect of modern crop varieties, which is really the international agricultural research. The sort of line is not completely linked to this, but very tightly linked to this. And this is where a lot of the policy discussion is actually happening. Has this subsidized environmental destruction? So the way we go about this is we use our model and we backcast to 1961. So we run the model backwards and get it to reproduce history. This allows us to produce a nice historical baseline with the model calibrated properly. And then we can run a counterfactual scenario where we remove this total factor productivity increase and see we have a factual and a counterfactual scenario, and we can do some uncertainty analysis. So we get reductions in total land area. This isn't surprising. It's about 16 million hectares worldwide. It's not reductions everywhere. If you look on the lower right map there, some areas there's actually increases in area, but on net it's a reduction. That's not that surprising. The question is, what did it do for emissions? And by and large, it also saved around 5 billion metric tons of CO2. And actually, it's interesting, there's a separate paper that looks at, what is the cost per ton of CO2, and it's actually quite low, even if you don't count the human welfare benefits. So this has been an efficient way to reduce CO2. Southern Africa is an area where land expanded and emissions increased. Also, it didn't push significantly into these particular biomes. So we reckon that productivity increase actually saved around 1,000 plant and animal species from extinction, with the exception again in Southern Africa over the period. So overall, this sort of land sparing technology did result in conservation. It's not true that the productivity that came out of the National Agricultural Research resulted in more environmental degradation, almost surely resulted in less. So this has been both, a lot has been avoided. So I think this backcasting structurally is really quite useful. We've done it in COVID-19, growth and poverty, trade and industrial policy in Domain 3. And I think it's really a healthy convergence of kind of data-driven, econometric, and structurally aware approaches. So that is. Then finally, and let me see. Yeah, I think we can. Yeah.
Yeah. If you have a few minutes on this, so this is interesting. So the addition of technology, you have more denser denser calories per acre kind of idea. It means you use fewer acres. But now, I think the counter argument might be, well, we have having more calories means that more people live, so they eat more. So then, how do you account for both the impact on induced demand? More food means more living people because you have less children dying, and the value of less children dying. Right.
Right. So we've done a lot on, productivity and poverty. Typically, it's only recently that we've seen, I think you were referring to some obesity issues. Is that right?
No, I mean just survival. I mean, since the 60s, we've had so many more people living to adulthood because of the extra food. But now they're also eating more, putting more demand on agriculture. So it's a cycle.
Yeah, no, that's right. But the quadrupling of, so we have sort of way more calories per person now than we did, right? All metrics of hunger over the period. I mean, in 1990, about 38% of the world, that's a really high number, had real difficulty buying just enough calories. That's it. So in very, very simple diets. I mean, you would be shocked, right? A lot of maize meal, some leaves, and maybe a stick of carrot or something like that. That's it. So that proportion is down to about 8%, and that's mainly a food-driven metric, that poverty metric that the World Bank uses. And so without this kind of increase in food production, you wouldn't see it. The other thing you wouldn't see, Greg, is the kind of demographic change that we've actually gotten, right? So, you had people eating not very many calories, but having 4 or 5 kids per woman, right? 6, right? And now we're down to, the only region of the world with really significant population growth is sub-Saharan, Africa, really, and Middle East into Pakistan. But overall, with the demographic transition, you're probably inducing, less food.
Good. That makes sense. And then one last thing is in terms of actual policy recommendations now. So, for example, one way, arguably, of avoiding deforestation is to do more intensive agriculture, that you don't need to deforest so much because of that. So, and now, this analysis suggests that is the case. I guess, are there any broader implications for local policies from this?
Yeah, so what we find, and it goes there, is, broadly, I think there's no way you can escape it, right? That either, since people are going to eat, right, and if you don't increase the productivity, you'll drive up prices, but that price will tend to push you into natural areas and drive environmental destruction, right? With the TFP argument, you're making people more efficient, and they may expand their operation, right? This is what happened in Southern Africa. But overall, the net effect is positive for the environment, and quite positive. So the argument that international agricultural research has been environmentally damaging, we don't think holds water at all.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, and actually, because in some areas it does drive the expansion of agriculture. Are there any ways, transportation or something else, to mitigate that and just find other ways of feeding that demand?
Absolutely. So, and that comes back to institutions, right? So we're moving on to the production implications of a trade war, U.S.-China trade war for Brazil, right? Mm-hmm. And just because historically a high price drove deforestation in the Amazon, that was conditional on the way that the Brazilians were enforcing their actual policies. Not that the policies are bad on deforestation, but the enforcement levels, the way the institutions function, and so on and so forth, drives what actually happens in the Amazon, what kind of land clearing you actually get, right? And that's really important part, right? So you're looking forward into that.
Got it. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. Let me see. So we did have a trade war with China back in 2018. This is the period when Chinese Brazilian exports of soybean to China leapt. And actually interesting, even though the trade war kind of went away, the Brazilian exports didn't go away. These things are pretty sticky. Once you switch over, you tend to stay. And so, whether there'll be another step change. And so we know about these existing impacts on the U.S. And, when you have this, what's not as clear is what's going on exactly inside Brazil, which gets to some of your points, Greg, on, where things go here. And then there's also, that's point 2. 3 is also, what does Brazil do and how that goes back into the rest of the world. We're going to focus more on 2. And basically, here we're going to link the 2 approaches that we've taken together, right? So we have our multi-regional GE model. That's the one that's going to worry about the trade war between China and the United States. And then we have our simple G that is going to be looking at crop supply, and this time uniquely in Brazil. And these 2 are merged together in this approach. So it looks something like this with the pictures of the two models together. So the production side in the GE model is standard on the left, but in Brazil for the agricultural sector, it's gridded, and it's about 100,000 grids for that. So we can look in detail what's going on. So here's some data. Red means almost all of the category talking about. So in the Northwest, it's almost all natural forest. Forest plantations are sort of speckled around, and you can see pasture and cropland, and you can see where the pasture really replaced the forest in one, sort of the central north up there. This is about 30 meter, well, aggregated to 5 arc minutes. Where are the crops? So this is on the left, oil seeds, mainly kind of in the south, running up the sort of the western side there. A concentration of sugar crops, sort of near Sao Paulo, and then other grains, largely in the south, same area as where some of the oil seeds are. So when we go ahead and just simulate these, and we've just recently done that, with a 25% tariff, we do get oilseed expansion, as you would expect, and we get to see where it expands. So the red is where there's incremental oilseed expansion. We tend to see a reduction in sugar, though not everywhere. And interestingly, we see some reductions in other grains, but in particular areas, we get an increase in other grains, and this is largely because soybeans and corn are multi-cropped together, and that remains a viable system in the new. So soybean actually drags more other grains into production. When you go and you look at what's happened to land use, we're not allowing it to move for the institutional reasons I spoke about into the forest, but we are allowing cropland to shift between pasture, to get from pasture to cropland, and basically the pasture and the cropland, that's the major shift. So a lot of conversion of pasture into cropland. So the reds and the blues are mirrors of each other in the two graphs up at the top, and then some conversion of forest plantation, which is mainly declining. So pretty considerable shift in land use. So, and this is we're pretty good at getting to these drivers of environmental change. These are often global. So, U.S.-China trade war, big push for export of soybeans from Brazil. What does that mean? But the solutions are often local. So this global to local to global is important. It relates to some recent work on the economic case for nature. Poor people more dependent on the natural capital. So running down that natural capital is not necessarily positive development, or something that necessarily the development process needs to do. And then, as we've been talking, and Greg's been emphasizing throughout, and I've been going to this with your questions, the institutions are key in actually getting to a lot of this. In terms of this stuff, there's global gridded ground. Some of the work with artificial intelligence, with the data that we can use, we can go below the simple G specifications and look at finer details. So typically, for example, you're going to see a fishbone effect in deforestation, so that the deforestation is actually happening nearest to roads. And so with some machine learning, some other algorithms, these kinds of effects, you could highlight where the hot spots are most likely to be, and where attention would most productively be allocated. So that's what I wanted to cover. I thank you for this opportunity to talk with y'all.
So yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you very much. So maybe first thing I can ask you, if you go back to the previous slide, you've kind of identified the role for machine learning at the ground level. Is that because that's where you have a lot of like micro data and there's something to train, whereas the forest level is just more community knowledge of things and you have little, like few samples?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the upside of machine learning at that level is quite high. It doesn't mean that we can't or shouldn't use machine learning at the other levels. We now have some colleagues, run their models lots of times and put in their papers, right? And so not only will it produce a model emulator, it'll explain the results in your style.
Right.
And tone, right? So you need to look at it, but there's a ton of use potentially for artificial intelligence in this broad area. Data, especially where we have tons of it, seems to make a lot of sense where you're sort of drowning in satellite data, not as much ground truth. That seems to be one. But also just in terms of simple model emulation that would quickly allow people to run things. They don't have to have the same level of skill to do things. We have, you spoke about institutional balkanization, right? Some people run these models on particular computer languages, right? And other people use other packages. And it does create a barrier, in terms of what can be done and how things are, and what people can talk about sometimes. I would love to see artificial intelligence being able to move codes between platforms, right? Translate between one computer language to another. These are all things that are on the horizon for us, I think.
So then let me ask you about this case, actually maybe improvement to fidelity of these trade models, and really maybe pushing into industrial models. You can imagine having models of, let's say, the operation of steel plants. Maybe not down to the chemistry, but at least the techno-economics. Same for road construction. Same for, well, all the industries across the world. Right now, it's infeasible because you don't even have explicit models of a lot of these phenomena. And if you do, they're hidden in papers, hidden in writing code. Is there an opportunity these days to start having these much higher fidelity models of individual industries and possible technological developments?
Sure. You could see what we're doing here, Greg. Almost all of these things involves linking up between different models, right? So the first application at GCMs and a hydrologic model, the second one we were looking at a whole bunch of data and some backcasting. The general equilibrium model is good at sort of keeping the bounds, keeping the system within bounds, and then making sure that the whole thing adds up, right? So I kind of view our job as keeping that in as good shape as we can do. And then when we dive down, so for example, if we're looking at mitigation scenarios for a region or for the world, we're not actually running often the generation technology within our model. We're running in an energy model that's specialized, right, for that. And then we're getting those models to communicate either in a hard link or a soft link, either by, in some cases, we internalize them directly. In some cases, we iterate to convergence. In some cases, it's just good enough to just kind of look at the results from the energy model and put it in the CG model, and you can eyeball it in. And all of those are probably better than trying to get everything to happen in one single mega model, right? So then you've got a suite of models that you can use that allows you to look in, kind of like what you're doing now, where, okay, we need to do, something's happening in the big wide world out there. Well, what does it mean for Brazil in a pretty refined way, especially when we're looking at environmental outcomes? That's the goal, local to global.
That makes sense. And now I've noticed that a lot of the work you've presented has been focused on equilibrium style modeling.
Right.
And you're not focusing on transient effects or something more agent-based where kind of get like the push and pull as the system settles into the equilibrium. Is the reason that it's extra complexity, it's hard to parameterize these more flexible models given the data you have, or some other reasons?
We do some agent-based modeling. This is we've presented the equilibrium models. Agent-based modeling is something that we should be heading to look in the future. I think that's correct. We do some of it. but it wasn't in the application set here.
Okay, and so then what are the challenges? Because I mean, as far as I can tell, the main challenge of agent-based is data, because it's just really hard to parameterize these things. And the data you're describing is sometimes local, but oftentimes it's very coarse and global, which makes it challenging. Is that a limitation you're hitting, or is it possible to get around it?
I think, in terms of facing 21st century challenges, right, for countries of reasonable size and sophistication, to include most, anything but, kind of leave off the Malawis and so forth. For the kinds of things that we're really concerned about, which is really the Earth environment area, right? And then the, climate change, then the trade industrial policy type stuff, and then the energy and mitigation sides, right? You can have an equilibrium model of the global economy. You can have, I think, a pretty good equilibrium model of your domestic economy, say Indonesia, and then you would want to dive in and have more detailed representations in agriculture, in the environment, in energy, right? And institutionally, you want these things set up. So where it works great, for example, with South Africa, the Treasury keeps, one of the few things that work great in South Africa, the Treasury keeps their general equilibrium model of the whole economy, and kind of a research institute in the Department of Energy and ESCOM keeps their energy model, and they talk to each other very, very effectively. Mm-hmm. But the Treasury is maintaining the general equilibrium model, and the energy people are maintaining the energy model. So institutionally, they don't, 9 times out of 10, they're not running together. Mm-hmm. But when we want them to run together, we can get them to run together. And we can do things like, what happens if there's a real transition to electric cars? And what's going on in the economy? And that would be the same with agent-based modeling, other things like that. And we can bring that in eventually, because once it goes to scale, then the equilibrium is quite useful, because that's going to force things to happen in particular ways and provide illuminating insights for what you need to know, right?
Okay, it makes sense.
Yeah.
So then another direction, is one thing that's the value of this kind of analysis is establishing causality for things. And you were giving examples of, like, because of this, the China tariff, the impact on Brazil is this, right? And so one really critical application of causality is things like carbon markets, where we have to establish the additionality of a particular project. And a lot of leakage being the big thing that trade flows are relevant for. So what are the challenges and opportunities for establishing, like, for everybody, this is, I protect the forest, so a nearby forest gets logged. I protect the region, and lumber production moves to a different part of the region because supply chains are, global.
Right. It's a total mess, Greg. We haven't figured it out, I don't think. So especially payment for environmental services and carbon, right? It has been historically a model where the supplier doesn't care about the quality that he's supplying or she's supplying, and the demander doesn't care about the quality of what they're buying, and it's a problem. I personally, and this is for discussion, think that perhaps it's easier to do at bigger scales than smaller scales, and trying to keep, if we can do, a whole island in Papua New Guinea, right? Then we just watch the whole damn island, right? Yeah. And, if you've committed, right, and we don't care, there's some development that's meant to be happening or whatever, but we can, with remote sensing, watch a lot of the forest cover in, on the whole thing. It could be a whole country, could be something like that. Right. I think that makes it a bit easier. But it is definitely the case that there's billions of dollars of money that want to buy carbon credits, right? Yes. And there isn't an efficient market for getting that to happen in a way. And that's that's an institutional question. We have a proposal to look at that. I have my views. But the reality is, people have been thinking about this for a couple decades, and we're still not really performing in that particular area. Now, other, just markets in general, Carbon by the EU is working pretty well. The CBAM, which we're looking at, that might have some effect as things get priced. We're just working with Morocco, and Morocco's like, well, shoot, we want to put on a carbon tax. Why? Because we don't want to use our biggest trading partner, and basically we're paying taxes to the EU instead of to ourselves.
Got it.
Right? Yeah. So, there's a kind of a spillover effect there that could then lead into, and depending on the amount of bureaucracy you put into place, you got to be really careful of that. Some kind of, if this people that are the group of countries that's doing carbon tax and putting CBAMs on there has sufficient, then you might get a little more buy-in and ability to police this stuff a little more. You need, with relatively low transaction costs, some kind of mechanism that assures quality, essentially, and it's been brutal to get.
Yeah, and so now on the more tracking emission side, I'm thinking the global trade flows. There's been proposals like liabilities that is effectively a VAT on emissions, and I guess you can do the same thing for water. The embedded water in the product travels through the value chain. So
right.
How would accounting for these externalities effectively propagate through your work and send global trade? Because now you have not just dollars, not just steel, but externalities traveling along the trade flows.
Yeah, we're really good at that. If we know more or less what's going on, right? And we do it with energy. That's how you calculate the CBAMs, right? Mm-hmm. They've got the products. It turns out that you got to be pretty energy intensive before $50 a ton carbon tax becomes really quite. 30% tariffs matter a lot. 2% tariffs don't matter that much.
Right.
Really. So, if it's coming in quite low, but for products that are relatively fossil fuel intensive, then we can track that. You'd have to, again, institutional issues. What can you do, and how do you make sure that these people have incentives to move to, higher or lower emissions technologies? Do you get rewarded if you yourself move towards a lower emission technology, but your country does not? If you're a business in there, say, for example, are you still going to get taxed the same way? Right. So that kind of stuff is.
So that actually brings maybe probably the last question is with the resolution of this. So it's natural that you have from imports. There's a lot of the data comes from duties on cross-border things. So you get a lot of natural data. While a lot of the phenomena are happening at the corporate level. So if I have my scope 3 emissions and I want to do liabilities on that, then I have to know which farm I'm sourcing from.
That's right. There you go. That's why agriculture is damn hard, right? Mm-hmm. So it's spread. It's all sorts of people. It's not. How many oil producers you got? How many people moving refined gasoline around the world? Well, okay.
Who's oil? I'm using that too. Yeah.
Yeah, we can track that, right? That's not that hard. But yeah, and that's why there's this interest in the artificial intelligence, the gridded, being able to track indicators that we can easily monitor, that kind of stuff that basically aligns the incentives. And again, I'll editorialize. I think, you don't want to get in that area. You don't want the best to be the enemy of the good, right? If you can pull it off, right? So as long as you're not hurting people, getting something that's more functional than what we've got.
Right. So
yeah. In economics, that's the big thing, right? Typically, the final gains from fine optimization in economics are tiny. But if you're way away from some more optimal equilibrium, then the gains of getting closer are really large.
So actually, though, this brings up a critical one. Being perfect is usually irrelevant, but being approximate often invites, in terms of policy, people like against the game theory thing. It's possible to cheat approximate analysis. So I guess maybe your experience, how accurate do you have to get before the cheats are irrelevantly small?
I think it's circumstance specific. Yeah, I don't think there's a single answer for that. I'm trying to think of, two examples, but generally it feels to me, it's the same in most. Take Brexit, right?
Mhm.
So the people who put Brexit as forward are now saying, well, the Brexit was fine, but we didn't implement it right. Okay, if we had done a better job, right? But actually, when you're forming the policy at the beginning, it is incumbent upon you to make an institutional assessment of whether that policy can actually be implemented in a reasonable way, and that includes a look at cheating and so on and so forth.
Yeah,
because they all have that, right? And being able to make it sufficient, hopefully make it sufficiently watertight is just part and parcel of what you're doing. And I think, we're never actually perfect. So, so it's just part and parcel of the analysis. I would say.
Okay, so I guess do the best you can and quantify the error and move on with your life.
And live with what you've got, and make sure the like I said, do you need, if you've got a carbon tax of $75, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you need to calculate a CBAM on men's t-shirts? Probably not.
Mm-hmm.
Probably not. It doesn't involve cheating. Well, really, who cares? It's 2% or something, 1% of the cost, something like that. Forget it. Do you want to put it on fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer?
Mm-hmm.
Almost surely, yeah, because there's a huge incentive to, do that process quite differently. So that, and then getting that lined up is where you want to burn your institutional resources.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. It was a fascinating talk.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation.